Welcome to One Eye on the Page. I'm Scott. We are doing 5-year battle, Stephen King, 1994 through 1998. 5-year battle. The 90s weren't generally seen as King's best writing period in general. However, it contains some of the writing that I like the best. So we're going to go through that. I'm probably going to have different opinions than you, which is going to be true for pretty much all rankings. So we're going to start with Insomnia, not one of King's most well known stories. And this is one of the areas where I'm probably going to be different. I love this book, like a lot. Ralph Roberts, the main character, is one of my favorite characters in any of King's writing. One of my favorite characters in all of fiction. He's just an ordinary old man suffering with insomnia, a little bit overwhelmed by changes in his life, including the death of his wife. He's just a decent guy trying to do things as well as he can. This gets a little Dark Tower infused. This is perhaps the most related to the Dark Tower of any book so far that wasn't a Dark Tower book. And I don't know how well that translates into the book. Honestly, I think that you could have skipped the Dark Tower related material and it would still been an excellent book, but the Dark Tower related material doesn't take away from it. It does get a little long in the tooth in the middle, but the last chapter of this book is, I said in the last video that it was perhaps the Stephen King book that I read the most. The last chapter of Insomnia is the piece of writing that I have read the most. Not the piece of Stephen King writing, the piece of writing that I have read the most. It to me, it's like the last like 2 minutes and 37 seconds of Jungle Land by Bruce Springsteen. That's probably my favorite piece of music, even though it's not my favorite Bruce Springsteen song. But those last 2 minutes and 37 seconds are my favorite piece of music. This last chapter is my favorite writing. This book is for the years 1994 through 98, at least currently, and probably going to be by the end of this video, number one. Rose Matter. Of Stephen King's 3 books in the 90s that basically are about women going through the ringer, this probably is the least successful. A woman escapes her physically abusive cop husband, and there's a supernatural element to it. Again, I think I've gotten to the point where some of Stephen King's novels, it's like you didn't need to add that in there. It almost feels like you added that in there because you have to, because you're Stephen King. And I don't feel like it was necessarily needed. Although, probably much more so than in Gerald's game, which I mentioned in the last video, which wasn't necessarily a supernatural element, but it was an outside element that I felt wasn't needed. This is one of those books where I will say one of my least read books. I have read this maybe 3 times, maybe once when it first came out, once in 2020 when I just read all of Stephen King's books again. And I would say probably one other point in there, maybe, but it may have been twice. So this is going to be ranked below Insomnia. I talked last video about certain choices I made for what I would include and what I wouldn't include. In 1996, Stephen King wrote The Green Mile. He wrote it in 6 parts that he released serially over a 6-month period. I am just going to do it as the final novel. I'm not going to rank each of the individual 6 parts. So we have The Green Mile by Stephen King. You've probably seen the movie starring Tom Hanks. I'll get it out of the way right now. There is another magical Negro in here. I think it's written better than previous versions, including Mother Abigail and Dick Halloran, but it's there. It's also trigger warning, more women being mistreated by men, much younger ones, unfortunately. It's unfortunately any time. But I got those bad points out of the way. Overall, this is a great novel. When you're going into it, perhaps, okay, I was expecting a happier ending. I'm not saying the ending is super depressing. I'm also not saying it's not super depressing. I guess that depends on your point of view. Paul Edgecombe is another character like Ralph Roberts, who's just kind of a Stephen King everyman that you can't help but loving his friendship that he has with Brutus and the other guards, minus Percy and Mr. Jingles, and even John Coffey. Even though it's a trope, he's still a lovable character. I don't often see this. I know people, a lot of people, I won't say all, a lot of people love the movie, but I don't generally see them really touting The Green Mile, the novel. Perhaps they thought more that it was just a gimmick, even though, as King says, this is how Charles Dickens did it before, and it is a great novel. Just unfortunately for it's in the same 5 year range as Insomnia, and I can't rank it above Insomnia. I understand that many, 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 many people would probably rank it above Insomnia. I am not one of those people. Stephen King had a big 1996. In addition to The Green Mile, he also published on the same day a book by himself and a book by Richard Bachman. I'm going to go with his book first, Desperation. Not as dark as the Bachman book, The Regulators, but this is still a very dark book. It shows King being ruthless with his characters. And it's funny that he does that because there's a lot of talk about God in here, that God isn't just love, God is cruel. And it's shown in this novel. And, regardless of your religious leanings, I mean, just look at the book of Job. God basically says, I made this world, I could take you out of it, essentially. But this book kind of goes over both of those. God is love and God is cruel, and says they're both true. Another writer character, this one, he's got flaws. I don't know if it's King taking a knock at his own persona, or if he had another writer in mind, or is this just complete fabrication of his own? But yeah, he can be brutal with the character. This is a very, very good book. It's almost sad that it's probably not going to get higher than my third best book of this 5 year time frame, but it just doesn't surpass Insomnia in The Green Mile. So I'm going to put it at number 3. Then we have Richard Bachman, The Regulators, which at this point in time is his second to last Bachman book. Bachman has had 2 books published after his death. The Regulators, not only it has characters with the same names as in Desperation, although they're not necessarily the same people. Like there are characters who are adults in Desperation and are children in the Regulators, and vice versa. And they're the writer character in Desperation is a much more hard person than the one in the Regulators. The one in the Regulators is a children's book writer who gets along well with his ex-wives. He doesn't in Desperation, even though The Regulators is a much darker novel. Some of the scenes are the same. There'll be like paragraphs that are written exactly the same in both books, although they end up having different meanings. Desperation was about God. This is about TV. It's my feeling that King writing as Richard Bachman generally isn't as good as King writing as King. You got The Long Walk and The Running Man that I think you could put up with, the best of Stephen King books, but not much else. It just pales in comparison to Desperation. Maybe they'd be viewed differently if they weren't released at the same time, but this one's real difficult because I don't know if I should rank this above or below Rose Matter. I think because of the gimmick that this one maybe goes slightly above Rose Matter, but not much. And we have Dark Tower 4, Wizard and Glass. Continuation of the story that we left off in the Wastelands with everybody on Blaine the Mono and the resolution of that. But the majority of this book is about a teenage Roland meeting his first love. And knowing Roland as we had for the first three books, we know that doesn't turn out well. So that is not a spoiler alert for you. It's almost a Western Romeo and Juliet. We know how that turned out. It's touching and it's a good story, but I think one, knowing what happens, and two, that so much of it was about Roland's past, which we needed to know about Roland's past, but I think just having so much of it, like it wasn't like when he published the final three Dark Tower books, where they were published. Two of them were published in 2003 and one in 2004. Generally, the Dark Tower, before he decided he needed to finish them after his accident, the first one was published in 1982, and then like I believe 88 and 92, so 4 or 5 years between books. So when you wait 4 years or so to find out the next thing, and when I say the majority, I mean the large majority of this is the romance here, which is good, but then I have the characters that I love and I wanted to know more about. I wanted to know more about Eddie and Susanna and Jake and Oi, and there just wasn't as much. So for that reason, really that reason alone, as I said, this is a very good book and a very good look at teenage love. Although, again, in a Western setting, in an alternate world than this, the Kings, you may not know it, can write romance. Check out Tabitha King's One on One, which is one of my favorite romance novels, although it's not wholly a romance novel, but it's also great. I'm going to internal debate. Internal debate. Do I put it above or below Desperation? I will let you comment and let me know. I'll wait. Okay. Perhaps that wasn't the best idea. I'm gonna flip a coin. I'm going to put it above Desperation for now, and I have a couple more books, and we will see if I change my mind, which I may. And finally, we have Bag of Bones. Bag of Bones is an interesting one because maybe even a decade ago, perhaps longer, if I had been ranking these, this might have been number two. I really love this book. And I still love it. There is a lot to love about this book. It's about a writer, so there you go. A writer whose wife has died. He finds out she was pregnant. He grieves, and then a few years down the road, he goes to his summer home and discovers things about her and discovers things about that summer home. And he also meets and falls in love. with a young woman, a much younger woman. And I think that's part of why I have doubts now about ranking it. Because when I first read it, I believe it was published in 1998. I was 28 then. And, I didn't put a lot of thought into that. The writer is, I believe, in his early 40s, early to mid 40s. And the young woman is Maddie. She is in her 20s. And I didn't think about, okay, if they get together, what is their life after? And for reasons I don't want to spoil for you, I feel that she was just a plot tool. And I think that does a disservice to her character. And that's why it's hard for me to rank this as high as I once would have. There, like I said, there's a lot great about this. When there's a writer, and this is written in first person, there's lots of talk about writing and books. And I love that type of stuff. I discovered some books in here that I hadn't known before that I read as a result of reading this. I like Mike, the main character, and I like Maddie, and I've forgotten, and I like Key, but it's hard to get over the love interest just being used as a plot device. And it's a little hard to look at who the bad guy is. And there's two bad guys in here. One of them, right away, it's Whitmore, who is Maddie's father-in-law. Her husband has died. And there's another one that we discover later in the novel. And it's that latter one that I have trouble with because I don't know that King did a good enough job of making her choices, and I gave away her gender, sorry, her choices make sense. It's hard to talk about without giving stuff away. But also, this novel plays heavily with race. I think it actually does a decent job, but considering King's past writing black characters, it was a dangerous choice. Again, I don't want to get too much into it because I want you to read it and enjoy it if you haven't already done so. But it would have been number 2 for me a long time ago. I'm ranking it below Wizard and Glass. So we have the final rankings. I am thinking right now, do I move Wizard and Glass and Desperation around? Do I? No, because I feel comfortable with Bag of Bones being above Desperation. And I think Bag of Bones should be below Wizard and Glass. So, final standing. Rose Matter. Number 7, The Regulators. Number 5, Desperation. Number 4, But I Love You Anyway, Bag of Bones. Number 3, For the Lovers, Wizard and Glass. There but for Insomnia, The Green Mile. And number 1, for me, probably not for you, Insomnia. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, read it. Seriously, read it. You will cry. If you don't, you're heartless, cold, and you're mean to me. All right, so that is 1994 through 1998. Next time we will do 1999 to 2003. This is around the time that Stephen King had his accident. So we will see a couple of novels that are written after that aren't particularly great, but we also see probably his best nonfiction book and also him ramping up the Dark Tower series. So until next time, we'll see you.